Hey, friends. We are in for a very, very special episode of Space for Life this week. We have as our special guest Dr. Os Guinness, who is one of the most prolific authors of our day. He's a modern day social critic. I think of him as a modern day prophet. And yet he is such an amazingly accessible and easy to read author. So we explore all sorts of topics in this upcoming episode, including hearing his story from being born in some of the worst days of China to his experiences in England and coming to faith, and then to the United States. And then we talk specifically about three of his powerful books, The Call, The Great Quest, and Signals of Transcendence. And these are phenomenal, game-changing books that I think anybody would enjoy. So Dr. Guinness is a frequent speaker and prominent social critic. He's addressed audiences worldwide, from the British House of Commons to the U.S. Congress to St. Petersburg Parliament. He's a senior fellow at the Oxford Center for Christian Apologetics, was the founder of the Trinity Forum. Written over 30 books, Dr. Guinness has a lifelong passion to make sense of our extraordinary modern world and to stand between the worlds of scholarship and ordinary life. He brings some of the deepest thoughts in a way that can be powerful for helping us in our own personal lives. You're in for an incredible treat today, as had the privilege and honor of speaking with Dr. Guinness. Enjoy the episode. Dr. Guinness, it's so great to have you on our podcast, Space for Life. It's a real honor for me. And our connection goes back actually probably a couple decades. I have read your books, many of them, and became more connected because you had a connection with my parents and their work down in Treasure Key. When they would go on vacation into the Bahamas, they were responsible for finding guest preachers for the community church. And you were one of those guest preachers, and had many opportunities to have dinner with my parents, and they just spoke so highly of you. And then after that, a little bit, we had the opportunity of hosting you for a luncheon after you're speaking at Third Church here in Richmond, Virginia, and got to meet you at that time. And so this is just a real pleasure and joy for me to get to reconnect with you with this podcast, and an honor, because I just think the world of all that you've done and written about and continue to write about. So thanks so much for being a part of this.
Well, thank you. Great memories of your parents, and it's a real delight to be with you again.
Well, thanks so much. So I'd love to kind of begin this podcast. I think that your story is probably one of the most diverse and varied stories, going all the way back to your childhood, that most people could ever associate with. So I'd love for those who are not as familiar with the story, for you to just take a few minutes and go all the way back to your childhood and the stories that you feel like brought you to where you are now.
Oh, that's kind of you. Well, as many people know, I come from a rather famous Irish brewing family. And my grandfather, though, was the first who went out to China as a Western doctor and founded a Western hospital. Both my parents happened to be born in China, and I was born there, and my two brothers, in World War II. Now, when the Japanese invaded, 17 million were killed. And to counter the Japanese army, the Chinese flooded the Yellow River, and overnight they killed nearly 1 million of their own people without any warning. And then we lived in an area infested by famine when locusts came in, and 5 million died in 3 months, sadly, including my two brothers. I nearly died. My mother nearly died. My mother was a doctor, but there was no food, no medicine, cannibalism, people dying in each other's arms in the streets. And then we moved from that to Nanjing today. And that was the capital of Free China, so-called. So I remember the day when my father said to me, son, we're in trouble. Chiang Kai-shek has just abandoned the city and left us at the mercy of the Red Army. And in they came, and I was there for the first 2 years of the Reign of Terror. So my first
Wow.
10 years, vivid with death and war and plague and revolution and persecution and so on. So it gave me from the very beginning, shall we say, a very realistic view of life.
Wow. I can't even imagine such a traumatic uh, first years in another culture and to be that close to such horrific death. It's almost like what we think about of being a part of a
Well,
Holocaust.
my parents had an incredible trust in God, and they didn't put it in the sentence, but looking back, I never saw them flinching in terms of their faith, despite the tragedies, above all my brother's deaths. But you could have summarized what my dad's view, and God is greater than all. God can be trusted in all situations. Have no fear, have faith in God. And so it was a time of immense realism and risk and danger. But my parents had that quiet faith in God, so I wasn't brought up with any great sense of trauma.
That's hard to even imagine. It's so counter to the way
Mm.
everything happens in our culture, where just the slightest blip just causes us to go off the deep end very often. And it's such a struggle, absent that kind of faith.
Well, as many of the ancients used to say, prosperous times breed rather soft people. And many Americans, sadly, have had it so good for so long that sense of entitlement, the slighter thing that happens, you feel upset. That's not how most of humanity lives today or has lived in the past. So I'm grateful for a background with very realistic understanding of life.
Wow, that's great. Well, I'm sure that informs a lot, and love to come back to that. So you were in China until 10 years old?
Yes, and then I went back to school and then university in England.
Okay, great. So how did that then take you down the path of writing and where you're going today?
Oh, I didn't set out to be a writer. In fact, I was interested in going into the Foreign Service and being a diplomat. That was my goal. But in 1968, I was living in Switzerland at a community called La Brie, and I had the chance to come over here as a tourist. And I was here for 6 weeks, East Coast, West Coast, Harvard, Berkeley, Stanford. I met Mario Savio, who led the free speech movement in 1964. And you remember, 68 was the year that Martin Luther King was assassinated, Senator Kennedy was assassinated. 100 American cities were burning. And so I realized pretty quickly as a European that to follow what was happening in America, things like that were happening in some ways in Europe, but not nearly as extreme. And so I went back to Europe and gave 10-minute talks, 20-minute talks, just to interest people. And then people came up and said, you should write this. What? Never thought of it. Just brushed them off. Eventually, my old English teacher said to me, you should write this. And so I did, a critique of the counterculture. And it actually did very well, my first book. And I sort of fell into writing through that, never set out to be a writer.
So the beginning books were really more social criticism of the culture and the current events going on at the time.
Well, I've always had many books like that. The first one, absolutely, and some of my more recent ones too.
Right.
But I've also had books on the Christian faith, on doubt, on coming to faith. And the one you have in your hands, Signals of Transcendence, is a book written for seekers and searchers.
And I loved it. My introduction, I believe, to your writings came, feels like 15, 20 years ago with the book, The Call. And that's been a book that was highly influential to me because I've always had this sense of wanting to understand what God's call was on my life and what I was supposed to do with my life. And it was the first time that I felt like the whole concept of call was framed in such a way that was so much bigger than just about me. And that was so helpful. So many of the concepts, the concept of the audience of one, that was the first time I had come across that concept. And those are concepts, and that book just shaped me tremendously. So I would love to particularly, I think, go during some of our conversation with those books that you were just talking about, The Call, The Great Quest, and Signals of Transcendence, all books that in my mind kind of talk about our personal journey towards faith and what that journey is like. And for those who may not be familiar with the books, would you mind taking a minute just to describe what the call, what you're referring to with the call, and kind of what you're referring to in The Great Quest, and how you would define this term, I think from Peter Berger, of signals of transcendence?
Well, The Call is by far my best-selling book. And if you think everyone in their life longs to have a sense of purpose, not just what life is about, but what's my life about? Who am I and what am I about? And so the deepest sense of purpose in all human history is what comes from the notion of God calling each of us. And people have sometimes made that far too spiritual and religious. So if you look, say, at certain Catholic dictionaries, even today, vocation or calling means going to the priesthood.
Right.
And that isn't the idea at all. That's far too narrow, far too shrunk. If you look at the call of Abraham, or the call right through the Old Testament, and above all, the call of Jesus, follow me, follow me, follow me. A tax collector, a fisherman, whoever they were, it's everyone in everything with the whole of their lives, everywhere they go. And so that book, but also that notion above all, has meant a tremendous amount, because there's a deep desire for purpose. So many people, I've met people, say, in their 40s, they did what their peers were doing, or what looked lucrative, or what their parents thought they should do. And then in their 40s, they felt like square pegs in a round hole. In other words, the old midlife crisis. They hadn't discovered to do what they were. So calling is do what you are before the Lord. So that's that book. Now, the other two, The Great Quest and this book, Signals of Transcendence, are both for searchers. I hope they'll be useful to Christians who want to give them to friends who may be searching, but they're written for seekers. If you look around America today and much of the West, you have an extreme of nihilism, no meaning at all, and people taking to drugs and suicide and so on. But many people in a much more comfortable level, they have too much to live with and not enough to live for. They haven't really thought through the meaning of life. You know, Socrates' famous saying, you mentioned it before we began, the unexamined life is not worth living. If he's right, millions of people are living lives not worth living because they haven't thought enough or cared enough to think through the meaning of life. So The Great Quest is a description of the journey. It's not an argument. I don't actually believe in the so-called proofs for God. It's not an argument. It's a description of the journey and the phases people go through in order to really search and come to a warranted or a faith of which they're truly convinced. So that's that book, The Great Quest. This one I absolutely love.
I did too.
My friend and my mentor, Peter Berger, Signals of Transcendence, he had the idea in the 60s, a little book he wrote, where he had 8 signals he mentioned in a single chapter. And as we became friends, and he was my academic mentor, we were going to write a book together. But sadly, he died. And so this is my understanding of it. 10 different stories of people who were triggered and prompted in their search by this beeping, beeping, beeping of signals of transcendence in their lives. What did he mean? Well, he meant simply that people have profound experiences that do 2 things. They puncture whatever they believed up to that point, not satisfactory, not adequate. And it points, punctures and points to something which, if true, would make all the difference. And so they set out to be seekers and searchers to find the answer and see whether or not it does lead to something solid and satisfying. So there are 10 stories, very, very different, some negative, some positive. Some people relate to one, some to the other, but I hope just in reading them, people would think through their own lives and whether they've heard those beeping, beeping, beeping of signals too.
Well, I think it's so on point, and there's such a diversity in the stories that you have in Signals of Transcendence. And I love it, stories of people that most of us have heard about, but never heard the stories and that signal that is behind the story. And what I also love about it is the whole process of seeking that's in the Great Quest and in Signals of Transcendence describe a path to faith that is so much less formulaic than we're often presented with. We're presented somehow with some truth, and all of a sudden we have a moment of conversion, and it's disconnected in a sense with what happened before and disconnected with what happens from there. And I love in Signals of Transcendence that you point out that often people have this experience, this signal that comes to them, and it's just the beginning. It's not the time where they come to a place of faith. It's the beginning of a turning of their mind that eventually comes to that. And I think you'll enjoy this story because it's what I think of as a signal of transcendence. It's for my brother, and I don't remember whether you met him, my brother Mike, when he was in college. He was not a person of faith at all. And we had a foreign exchange student living with us at the time. And the two of them were out on the beach one night, and they were just lying down at the end of a long weekend night, and they were just exploring. And they said, I don't really know if I believe this God thing. What do you think? No, I don't know that I believe it either. And they said, well, I know someone told me once that if you pray for something in Jesus' name, that it'll happen. And they both kind of laughed off that thought. They said, well, I tell you what, let's try it. And they had no faith whatsoever. And so they said, okay, dear God, don't know whether I'm just praying into air or not, but if you're there, will you make it clear that you're there? Well, when we open our eyes, could we see a shooting star? And they said, in Jesus' name, and opened their eyes. And at that very moment, 2 shooting stars came from the opposite ends of the sky and crossed at the top. And it was this moment for both of them where they went, oh my goodness, this maybe is real. And it took years after that, or some lengthy period before they actually came to faith. But it was this, what I understand from what you're writing, it was like this signal of transcendence that was the beginning of their journey to a totally changed, transformed, faith-filled life.
Well, Tommy, let me tell one of the stories, because so people get an idea.
Great.
Because we're talking about words that are just purely abstract. But the one that I absolutely love, and that probably resonates with more people than the others, is W.H. Auden. Because today there's a passion for justice, say post-George Floyd, among many, many people, including young people. Well, Auden was one of the best 20th century poets. And when he left Oxford University, he was well known as a great poet, as an atheist, as an open gay at a time when it was very unfashionable to be a gay, and also radically on the left. He fought against fascism in the Spanish Civil War. So when World War II was looming, he left Europe and came over to the US, to New York, Manhattan. Now, of course, when Britain declared war on Germany, America was not in the war. So many supported Britain, and the Germans and others supported Germany. Now, there was no television in 1939. So to follow what was going on, apart from the newspapers, you went to your local cinema and watched the Pathé documentary news. And he went to Upper East Side to Yorkville, and unbeknownst to him, most of the audience were German. So they were on the side of the Germans. And the documentary was on the siege of Poland and Nazi stormtroopers bayoneting women and children brutally. But despite it, the German audience cried out, kill them, egging them on. Auden sat there in the darkness. And in 5 minutes, his whole worldview was overturned. First, he said, I knew there was evil. He'd always thought people were basically good. No, I could see evil, and I recognized it's in my heart too. But then the real problem. He said, I had to be able to say that Hitler was absolutely wrong. Absolutely, not relatively, not just as a Brit looking at the jet. No, absolutely wrong. So as he put it later, I left the cinema a seeker after an unconditional absolute and met Jesus. Now, in his case, it wasn't long between that extraordinary experience in the cinema and his coming to faith. With others like C.S. Lewis and others in the book, it was more than a decade. But the signal is what constitutes the seeker. They're no longer satisfied. Their old worldview punctured. He had to say this is absolutely wrong. Relativism wouldn't satisfy. But that doesn't mean it's a signal as a signpost in sound, as it were. Right. Other people have it in sight, but you've got to then do the searching. So I hope your brother and his friend both did that, both of them.
They did. Very interestingly, just a few years after that, Eric, the foreign exchange student, contracted cancer. He was back in Sweden at the time and went through a difficult battle of the cancer and eventually died. And he sent a tape to my brother, Mike, in the last months. And the very last thing that he said on the last tape that my brother received was, I remember the night of the shooting star. And so it's just...
Tommy, sorry.
Go.
One of the stories, and I love this one too. Many Americans don't know Kenneth Clark, except for his magnificent BBC series, Civilization. He was a great artist, art historian, director of the National Gallery, you name it. In his memoirs, he describes a time when he was in Florence and he was overwhelmed with the beauty of what he was looking at. And he said, I felt the finger of God. And he said it lasted for something like 3 months, but he brushed it off. If he'd gone back to London, they would have thought he was a crackpot. He was actually, we know now, having an affair, and it would have been morally rather embarrassing. Anyway, he brushed it off. And if you read his memoir, you think that's the end of it. Not at all. At his funeral at St. James, Piccadilly, where many of the royalty of the arts world in Europe were there, people were stunned when a priest got up at the end and said, Lord Clark wants you to know that he was accepted into the church 6 months before he died. People were grumbling, what? Deathbed conversion? Never heard such rubbish. This is hoax. His wife got up and said, no, it's true. He brushed off the finger of God earlier in his life. But then he came back. And I thank the Lord, it is never too late.
That's so great. And it just shows the diversity and the expansiveness of God, that he can be patient with us for that long, and he can use such a variety of signals, a signal of evil in the case of W.H. Auden, in another case, a dandelion that would cause someone to come to faith. I mean, how big and how much bigger is God than we ever give him credit for? I absolutely love that. Was there something that you would describe in your own life as a signal of transcendence? I know it sounds like you came to faith really very early as a child, but how did that play out in any particular way in your life?
Well, actually, no, it didn't come through a signal of transcendence. Not everyone does. And I didn't really become to faith as a child.
Hmm.
When my parents were allowed to send me back under the care of someone else to England, I went to school and then college in England. But most of my teenage years, I didn't have my parents. They were under arrest in China. And so I was independent. And my own journey to faith was actually partly through a friend and partly an intellectual search. I was not attracted to what I knew from the East of Hinduism and Buddhism. For me, the search was between atheists like Nietzsche, whom I still read, or my hero then, Albert Camus, and people like Jean-Paul Sartre. And on the other side, people like G.K. Chesterton, Blaise Pascal, and of course, C.S. Lewis. And after 2.5 years or so, I was convinced, deeply convinced, that the Christian faith was true. And that's when I came to faith myself. So I wasn't a settled atheist or anything, and I didn't need unsettling in that sense by a signal like that. But I have met many who have been through that experience.
Well, that's great. That's helpful. You came to faith fully with your mind.
Well, a complete person, of course, not just my mind.
Sure.
I have behind me, the other side of my study, a whole number of autographs, including Rodin, the sculptor. And almost everyone has seen his famous statue, Le Penseur, the thinker, sitting there on the rock thinking. When Rodin describes it, he says, look at it carefully. It's not just his mind. You can see every sinew of his muscles right down to his toes gripping the rock. He is thinking like that as a whole person. And I love it because, people talk about intellectuals, and often those who are intellectuals are only minds. Whereas we're whole people, red-blooded people. We think, we feel, we decide. We're whole-blooded people. And it's as full whole-blooded people that we have to come to Jesus. I make the wonderful point in The Great Quest. I learned this from someone who was in Kenya. And he was describing to an African, a Kenyan warrior, Kikuyu warrior, the ideas of faith. And he used the word, and the Kikuyu stopped him. He said, that word is no use. That's like your English word, assent, a kind of long-distance agreement with something, rather like a Western hunter with a good rifle who can shoot an animal a long, long way. No, that's not our word, he said. Our word for faith is the same word we use of a lion pouncing. The great leap and all four legs enclosing the quarry. He said that is faith, a whole person with a complete commitment to the Lord. And of course, that's the point in which we find the Lord is gloriously real too. And as C.S. Lewis says, we think we're searching for him, and then we suddenly realize how foolish. All the time he's been looking for us.
That's great. It's the prodigal father running to the son, who's probably walking very slowly in that direction. I love that. So it seems like, one of the reasons that I wrote the book Space to Breathe Again a couple of years ago was out of the conviction that we're going so fast in our culture, and that there is so much noise and distraction and speed all around of us that there's no space for us to experience life. And it seems like underlying all of the call, the great quest, and signals of transcendence is this thought of the examined life, and that it begins with a willingness to live an examined life, to examine your life. And I'd love to hear your thoughts, because I know you deal kind of with the social side and the culture also of how do we deal with that in our culture where we're so inundated with noise, how do we break through that to help people see the value and the importance and the priority of and the challenge of living an examined life?
Well, you can't really prepare for it, but I agree with you fully on the problem. In other words, always in human life, it's kids who ask questions. Daddy, why this? Mommy, why that? Endless curiosity. And of course, we grow up to be adults and we haven't time. We're too busy and too serious for questions like that. And so we stop asking questions. We end our curiosity. And then, as you say, our modern world, you may have got the same quotation I did. Someone's described the social media as weapons of mass distraction. The triple screen gazing and so on, the so-called screenager, the teenager totally dependent on the cell phone. Well, our good friend Blaise Pascal, he described this in the 16th century, 17th century. He called it diversions. In other words, humans don't want to face reality. And this final reality, of course, is all of us are going to die. And we don't want to think about things like that. So we surround ourselves with busy, entertaining distractions. And I'm sure your book is all about that. I'm sorry I haven't seen it. But we're talking about the same problem. Now, the signal break into that. Life prompt, there's more. There's something more than you're realizing. You're like a prisoner in the cave, and there's sunshine outside the cave. Or as Peter Berger puts it, you're living in a world without windows. But there's a wider, greater, higher world up there. So people have got to be open when signals like that strike them in. There must be something more. Do they have the honesty and the guts to follow through the questions? That's the point.
Exactly. And as you said with Kenneth Clark, the fact that the signal might come doesn't mean necessarily that we'll listen to the signal or that we'll turn with the signal. We still have the choice to go whatever direction and respond to the signal however we might choose. And that
right.
punctuation of the signal, I love it, was with C.S. Lewis, it was surprised by joy. And I guess we're very fortunate that God's willing to puncture our distractedness often and get our attention with signals. We probably wouldn't do it on our own. That's very helpful. So I'd love to maybe just transition a little bit. There's such great thoughts. I love those books. Those are books that are, I think, incredibly accessible, which is what I love about your style of writing. It brings such a breadth of experience and knowledge from so many different people, but they're always very, very personal and accessible. And so I really encourage anybody listening to this that those books are absolute fabulous reads. I've loved them myself.
They're short books and simple, and they're stories. As you know, I've got much longer and more complicated books, and some of them, when you get into American politics, are controversial too. But those two books, and The Call too, are simple and straightforward.
Yeah, they're great. So I'd love to, transition. You have this sense of the call and the importance of having a clear purpose in your life. What are some habits and practices that you employ, perhaps still employ, to keep yourself centered in what you believe God's purpose and call is for your life?
Let me just mention very simple things, Tommy. The first is my wife and I practice morning worship every day. Individually, and then we pray together. So every day I try and spend an hour partly reading the scriptures, partly praying, and it just gives you your priorities and your perspective on the day, so you don't just rush into it as the agenda of yesterday might have said, and so on. So that to me is a very important part of our day. And then my wife and I have fellowship every Sunday evening with dear friends. And fellowship like that, of course, we go to church and worship and so on, but fellowship like that is not only fellowship and biblical instruction, but also accountability. So we all understand the callings that others have in the group. Sometimes we need to be encouraged, we're beaten down. Sometimes we may need to be held accountable, getting too big for our boots or whatever. But that fellowship group of friends to inspire and hold accountable, incredibly important. And then the third thing, Tom, and I'm sure you mentioned this in your book, is the great biblical notion of the Sabbath.
Oh, absolutely.
Now, when I grew up in Europe, it was surrounded the Sunday with so much legalism that you never really understood the Sunday, and it was always a negative thing. You were feeling guilty, and so on. But actually, you read the great Jewish writers, rabbis like Rabbi Heschel and so on the Sabbath as a day of stopping, of time out, of remembering the rest of the week, we're little creatures, entrepreneurs in our own little world, doing all we can in our thinking and acting to do all. But then that one day of the week, no, we have a creator. It's not all up to us. And there's a timeout. That's an incredibly important part. And I think, again, to go back to the social media, now that cell phones have become so all-devouring of our attention, Sunday is increasingly a day when people just put their cell phone by. I almost never do an email on Sunday. I wouldn't mind breaking the exception occasionally, but no emails on Sunday. None of my normal writing on Sunday, and so on. And I find that whole notion of the Sabbath, a day of rest and cessation, remembering I'm just a little person and I have a far bigger Lord and Creator. That's incredibly important. So those three things for me are very vital, and I'm sure you covered them all in far greater depth and richness in your book.
Well, I love it because it is exactly what I write about in the book, and the transition for Wheezy and I from the stage in our life in our 30s that I write about, where we became completely overwhelmed and overloaded to the point of feeling like it was a nervous breakdown. The turning point was beginning to practice the Sabbath. And I talk about it, quite a bit on the podcast, of how it made no logical sense. If we couldn't get things done in 7 days, how were we going to get it done in 6 days? But it was a choice to say, God knows a better way. And that was the beginning of a long transition. And the things you're talking about, again, so awed in many ways by so much that you've done, and yet the practices are the simple practices that are accessible to every single one of us. They're not easy to fit in that time of worship in the morning and that time of undistracted fellowship with friends, but they're accessible to every one of us, and they're the path to growth. So I appreciate it. It's affirming of everything that I've thought and write about, and to hear you say the same things is just great. So,
Tom, I was greatly helped by that little American phrase, time out. Because often Sunday and the Sabbath, as I said, becomes legalistic and negative and guilt-ridden. But time out in football is very positive. Maybe a play's broken down or you have an incredible new idea. That little timeout is fully positive for the coach and for the players. And that's what Sunday is, time out. So that back on Monday morning in the week of work, we're more engaged and clear in our commitments and so on. So the timeout is very positive.
It's a gift from God. It's not an
Absolutely.
obligation. It's a gift from God. Well, thank you so much for your time. There's so much, I think, for people to benefit from that are listening to this, and it's great to reconnect with you. I'd love to send you a copy of my book. It's a short book also, but I think it will resonate so many of the ideas with things that you've talked about here and believe in. So I'd love to send you a copy of that. And so thankful for your time.
No, real privilege. Thank you, Tommy.